Alright guys, let's talk here about the Goths. Goths' biggest strength here is the infantry play, and that can actually translate into game by their options here, which are basically going for Drush and Men-at-Arm openings. The Goth infantry have at least 3 bonuses that all stack together, and we are talking here about 1. Infantry costing less 15% starting from the Dark Age, and that scales until 30% on the Imperial Age, so that's a huge discount. 2. Their infantry has +1, +2, and +3 attack versus buildings starting from Feudal Age. So basically you are just going to deliver extra damage to buildings, which means that basically you need no arson for the Goth. You are naturally gonna have extra attack versus the buildings. And third one is your barracks do work 20% faster. The synergy of those 3 bonuses makes the Goth infantry play something that you want to go to. So usually the most common way of getting benefited from this is going for Men-at-Arm openings or Drush openings. For example, on this case we have here a ranked game between Chart and Babaorium, 2 very strong players, and as you can see Chart is moving around here with 2 militias, planning to deal some small damage here to Babaorium. He doesn't manage to kill a villager, but then he's just starting harassing his houses and add a couple extra militias, soon to be Men-at-Arms, in order to pressure his opponent even more. With access to this Men-at-Arm, this can force your opponent in some very awkward situations, like having to wall his full base or using lots of resources and actually opening archers if he wants to have a good counter to the Men-at-Arms. So the best counter to the Goth infantry is actually archers, because if you try to play this with scouts or something like this, it's very easy for the Goth to actually add up a new spearman and just make your life very difficult to engage if you're trying to play scouts. So the archer line counter is a very common thing for the Goth, so every Goth player should be aware of that, and it's very common for the Goth player to actually follow up their Men-at-Arm opening here with skirmishers. So whenever you're playing with the Goth, already expect to play a skirmisher war, because players will try to defend themselves from your Men-at-Arms, and then they're just gonna start trading with your skirmishers. So when you are fighting against good players, they are often not going to allow your Men-at-Arms to hit their army. So this will basically be a ranged unit war, where you're both going to be harassing each other with skirmishers, and my personal recommendation is do not waste or try to use your Men-at-Arm to kill the enemy army here, because he will just read and run and make your Men-at-Arms weaker and eventually kill them. Instead, my personal suggestion for the Men-at-Arm player is to try to save up his Men-at-Arms and harass the buildings. By doing this, you can apply a constant pressure on your opponent, while always just shielding up or backing up your infantry using your ranged units. So Men-at-Arm plus skirmisher is the most common army composition and army combination that you will be playing as the Goth during the Feudal Age. Later, for the Castle Age, the Goth technology tree has a wide variety of things here. You can actually go for crossbowmen, you can actually go for cav archer, you can actually try to go for the knights as well, because well, knights are pretty decent for the Goth. You do have access to bloodlines, you do have access to husbandry. What you might actually lack here as the Goth player during the Castle Age is any kind of economical bonuses. For this reason, try to be as aggressive and annoying as possible during the Feudal Age to try and get your economy behind on economy for using way too much resources to defend or even losing villagers. Once you do that, it's up to you to play during the Castle Age with whatever your civilization has to offer. For example, on this game you can see the Goth player already switching into Elite Skirmisher plus Crossbowman, which is a quite interesting composition to fight against enemy ranged units, and then of course you can actually switch back to do different kind of armies according to each situation. Let me show one of the situations that I think that is not so commonly used for Goth players, but I think that is pretty decent and players should be looking forward to use it a lot more. And I'm talking about going for the cav archers. Right there, as you can see, the Goth player started to play with a lot of ranged units like Elite Skirmishers and Crossbowmen, but his opponent answers by adding several rocket carts. Rocket carts are pretty dangerous and difficult to micro against. Once your opponent has a couple of those, it becomes very miserable to fight against these using your ranged units. For this reason, I think that I personally recommend the Goth to use its other weapons in order to deal with that. And by other weapons, I do mean using like knights, using like cav archers, using like mangonels, and just boom in order to go towards the next age. So do not think that because you are Goth, you are necessarily having to focus like in a full infantry gameplay. You can actually benefit benefit yourself from your early bonuses and just transition into something like full Cav Archer. Despite not having the full technology tree and lacking a few upgrades such as Tumbling and Part and Tactics, your Cav Archers are still pretty decent, and in some scenarios they can actually be one of your best options here to play as the Goth. So do not stick with the idea that Goth are only an infantry civ, because they are much more than that. On this game, as you can see, the enemy is attacking here with Steppe Lancers and Rocket Carts. To be honest, I would say that engaging this composition using infantry would require way too much infantry, and doing this during the early stages of the game would actually be very costly and could actually snowball into a defeat for the Goth player. But instead, just fighting on the long distance using the Cav Archers and other weapons allows the Goth player to benefit himself from his wide tech tree to actually punish the opponent. So you are not always gonna have to deal with your enemy using full infantry. If there's something else than infantry that the Goths are good at, it's to placing themselves into awkward situations. The fact that they do not have stone wall to fortify their defenses and even for the Imperial Age is of a little help. What actually matters here is that most civilizations will have access to good options to pressure the Goth during the Castle Age. For example, on this game here from the League 1 Cup, you can see Hera versus Hart, and Hart is pressuring Hera fiercely here using two of the best units of the game, both Knights and Cav Archers. You can argue that the God could actually do both, but the thing is, the Knights from Hart can actually scale into Cavaliers, and they will actually have access to all the upgrades. The Cav Archers from Hart already have extra HP, and they can also scale into Imperial Age and have access to all the upgrades. So this is basically a composition that will scale better than Goth, and not only that, but the Vietnamese has several economical bonuses that the Goth has no access to. So even if Hera tries to do the similar kind of fight here, he will never be able to win this fight during the Castle Age. And by not winning, I mean he can even try to match the numbers, but then he's not going to match the economy. And even if he does, he cannot upgrade his economies later. So if there's one thing that the Goths should actually do here is to aim to go for a big infantry span against certain civilizations. This is like their only hope. They're probably not going to match most cavalry civilizations, but most cavalry civilizations are actually going to lack options to fight against these Halb and Hurskal infantry here. Let me just give a few examples. Huns can actually scale towards the Imperial Age, but they do not have access to good infantry. They can only play Cav Archers and and also cavalry, which means that a big composition of Hurskals plus Halberdiers just patrolling constantly can pressure this civilization. So if a civilization has no hand cannoneer, it will actually gonna be very vulnerable against the Goth. Let me just go for a few examples. Vietnamese are going to be very vulnerable to the Goth. Bengalis are actually going to be very vulnerable to the Goths. Huns are actually going to be very vulnerable to the Goths. So in this stage of the game, they can actually counter several civilizations. The problem is for the Goths to survive these stages. So right there, as you can see, the Goth player is trying to greedily boom here, adding defensive castles so that he won't get pushed, and just trying to mimic or just trying to nullify their opponent's push by killing his own siege. So that's kind of tricky to do when you are the Goth, because you know already that you are not going to be able to compete against your opponent. So trying to use a mix of pikemen, knights, siege, monks, everything you want here, everything you have is the way to go. It's a very awkward position, but the Goth is about to go for his strongest gameplay, which is basically going for the infantry span. In order to go for the infantry span, the Goth needs to have at least one castle. This one castle will actually allow the Goths to get access to the upgrades, but of course, as you can see, very awkward position if you are the Goth and you have to play against this. So despite how tricky that can be, once you survive, you are actually going to be able to spend several infantry units, and this will actually be one of the secrets of the civilization: how fast they can produce and how cheap their infantry is. Their most expensive infantry unit is the Hurskal. But the thing is, for an Imperial Age economy, it's very easy to afford Hurskals. But what's really necessary for the Hurskals to make the difference is to actually have access to their elite upgrade. With their elite upgrade, they are also gonna scale their armor, also gonna scale their HP, their attack. Every one of the stats is actually gonna scale. For some civilizations, the elite upgrade doesn't change so much. For example, if you're playing with like elite composite bowman and other units as such, such, the elite version doesn't do much for your unit. But when we're talking about Hurscal, well, the elite upgrade does a lot. You're actually going to be able to endure feudal age arrows with the same efficiency as you can endure the castle age ones, and basically you are actually going to be able to start trading pretty well even against castle age units. But do not mistake yourself, the Hurscals have a weakness here. They do have 0 base melee armor, so on the melee combat they are gonna still struggle if they have to fight against strong infantry units or strong melee units, for example the knight line. So in order for the Hurscals to actually benefit themselves from that, they actually need to be mixed in with a few halberdiers. If you do not mix your Hurscals with halberdiers, this is what can happen. Your opponent, even with a castle age army, can actually overcome and surpass you. So that's once again a very awkward position that the Goths are putting themselves in. So the secret for the Goths pen is have a huge economy, especially farm wise, and I'm talking about having like this amount of farms, like 50 more at least. Then you actually produce a several amount of barracks, upgrade your pikemen, and then you start combining both pikemen and Hurskal. Only then you are actually going to be able to access the full potential from the Goths, and this is how the Goths were designed to be played. A menace here to any ranged unit that cannot run from them. And of course, if they actually have to face cavalry units such as the elephants, such as the cavalier, then you can just win by numbers by upgrading and spamming the halberdier. On this game, things were very tricky, and Hero felt in a very overwhelmed position against the Vietnamese. Hart was constantly attacking, constantly hating, so he was basically losing during all the game. And then suddenly you see how the God can swing things here once he has the access to his full Goths infantry span. Many halberdiers and many Hurskals that basically you can afford and keep the quill here always full and just span over your opponent. Right there he has no other special upgrades to make these work, so there are still some upgrades that the God can do, and I'm actually going to talk about 2 of them and why they are so important and how they can actually benefit the Goth Civilization. The first one of these upgrades here is the silver crown called Anarchy. Anarchy will allow the Goths to produce Hurskals on the barracks, so you do not need to use anymore the castles. You can even lose your castles, but as long as you have the barracks, you are going to be able to keep spamming the Hurskals. And the second one is Perfusion. Perfusion actually allows your barracks to work 100% faster. This will actually, combined with your natural 20% faster barracks and conscription, this means that you can almost instantly start spamming units. So going for these castle upgrades, conscription, perfusion, anarchy, will just allow the God to have the perfect setup. And the thing here is not about killing or having good battles, but winning, but spamming, and even if you are constantly losing battles, you are actually going to drain your opponent's resources faster than yours. For example, what actually seemed to be a very good deal for Hart a few minutes ago during the Castle Age, which was basically playing with cavalry and knights, is now a nightmare for Hart, because basically if he tries to go for the light cavalry line, they won't have the amount of power required to deal with the Hurskals. The Hurskals in similar economical numbers actually are able to outnumber the Cavaliers. So even trying to counter the Hurskals with Cavaliers is becoming a threat for for Hart. You know, actually, if he stops going for the Cavalry Archer, there will be no other unit that will deal a significant amount of damage to the Halberdier line, which will actually leave the Cavalier exposed. And the biggest problem with this is both of these are gold units. So for some civilizations without hand cannoneer, having to fight against the Goth is a full nightmare, because you basically have no good counter to infantry and you have to rely on gold units. And when you do rely on gold units, you are actually fighting against a civilization that can just keep spamming at a cheaper cost. And this is where the God becomes such a threat. So a composition that seemed to be way too stronger for the God to deal with during the previous age is now totally acceptable, and there's something that the God basically doesn't have much things to do about. The Vietnamese cannot do much about. So it's basically about spamming halberdiers, spamming Hurskals, getting your crown upgrades, and of course, if you can start spamming barracks throughout the map, you can start raiding and spamming infantry on your opponent's economy. Right there, Hart economy is underwhelmed. Despite of how many good fights he got, and despite how positive the KD might look, so far Hart has killed like 300 units and only lost like 200, The God actually wants that. It's very common when you are a God player to have a negative KD, so you are indeed going to lose more units, but you are not going to win on the quality, but rather on the quantity. So if you do like spam, and if you do like big infantry battles, and you like to overwhelm your opponent with numbers and continuously producing army, God is most likely the civilization for you, and that's exactly what you want and what to expect here for a Civ. We have discussed already some of the other options that the God can use, for example Revikib archers, hand cannoneers on Imperial Age, but your A plan and the plan that you should always stick to, if possible, and the strongest way to play the God is to go for full infantry span. This honestly, in my opinion, is one of the most annoying things to deal with. Unless you have some very specific unit or technology tree, you're actually going to get overwhelmed, and the God infantry having these extra attacks versus buildings, making their Hurskalls very difficult to deal during the Imperial Age, because not only they can raid, but they can also kill any building that is trying to hide your villagers quite easily and quite fast. So that's probably the best nature from the Goths and how they want to play. This is one of the best examples. It might be a bit awkward to play during the mid game, but all that you have to do is to make a strong early game using your infantry play and just buy enough time for you to play towards the Imperial Age. Of course, once in Imperial Age, this is your game, spend infantry everywhere on your opponent economy, spend both halberdiers and Hurskalls, making it very difficult for your opponent to counter, and this will lead to his demise. Most civilizations that doesn't have a good infantry line or hand cannoneers will actually suffer a lot to kill the God. One of other options that a few civilizations might have are to actually wall. So in my opinion, one of the best ways to deal with the God is to try to fully wall yourself and try to focus all the fights in a single point and try to win with your quality, because on the quantity you are never going to stop the Goths. So if you do like infantry, Goth is surely one of the civilizations that you should be looking forward to. And honestly, there's a lot of room and new strategies that you can exploit as the Goth. Let's go now for another game and take a look on the God here. So once again, my expectation here is that the God player already start here with Loan if possible, because you can actually research Loan instantly. This means that you are going to have the same amount of villagers as your opponent, but you are actually going to have stronger villagers, which can be good for lemming, which can be good for taking boars, and even to view fight. So if you want to send already one villager forward to go there and lame your opponent's hunt or make some building on his mill or anything, you can always also do that, because you are going to have Loan. The only two other civilizations that can have Loon on the start without delaying their gameplay are Chinese and Mayans, because both started, one without the food and the other without housing population. Apart from that, Goth is the third civilization that will already have a full Dark Age with Loon, and we are talking about excellent build artists here. We're not talking about guys that are doing Loon at villager number 8 or 9. That can actually be the case for lower elos, but on the higher elos you also want to skip that. But not for the God. Now let's take a look here on a regular God game. The God player is actually going for the barracks and is starting to make militias, so he's aiming to go for men at arms. He's already going heavy here for the gold and spamming a lot of militias. His opponent knows that he's playing against the God, and look how he does open, guys. Instead of going for the mill, he's already opening here with a mining camp and some villagers on the wood, because he's counting that the God player will eventually start harassing him with men at arms, so he does want to defend here using archers. And that's a very, very common situation for the God player to get actually anticipated and countered by archer ranges. Upon adding up the archer ranges and some walls, this actually forces the God all the way around, and by the time the God can actually reach some spot to attack, the enemy already has some archers prepared. So that's one of the most common things that can happen to a God player, get fully countered and lose his men at arms. So different from the previous game, this guy actually tried to fight against the enemy archers, and in my opinion this is a huge mistake. As I said, the best use that you can actually have for your men at arms is to keep them alive as much as possible, to keep harassing buildings, and just use your own ranged units to trade. Of course, you are not necessarily it's not a must that you actually play with the skirmishers. You can actually just go for archers as well and try to mirror your opponent, but to my personal experience it actually works a lot better for you if you just go for the elite skirmishers, since they're actually going to be a natural counter. And think about this game: if this guy still had his men-at-arms, he could just keep trading against the enemy archers and allow the men-at-arms to start harassing the enemy buildings. In my opinion, that would actually be the most effective way of playing. Anyway, with that said, let's move towards the castle age, because there are other significant plays that the Goth can do, especially versus civilizations that are very focused here on archers. So if you're playing, for example, against a civilization that has a huge focus on the archer play and also lacks good knights, lacks like bloodlines, and I'm talking about Vikings, I'm talking about Byzantines, I'm talking about Britons, I'm talking about Mayans. Against this kind of civilizations, that is one kind of play that can actually work. It's a very weird one, but which is basically anticipating horse calls. So on the way to the castle age, as you can see this guy playing, you actually go heavy here on the stone, so that by the time you does reach the castle age, you already drops off a knight, a castle, and with this castle you start dropping off horse calls. By the way, there is also a few other upgrades, for example Anarchy, that will allow you to produce horse calls from the barracks, and that can actually boost up your production. So it's up to you if you want to go for early Anarchy or just use the castle to make the horse calls production. Horse calls are a great raiding unit because basically they have a very high stat on their pierce armor, making them very good to raid under town centers and very difficult for your opponent to kill, because they also have 10 base attack, so the same attack as the knight and more armor. Of course they do have less speed and less HP, but things compensate each other and they are actually a very good raiding unit. Not only that, but if in case you are not being able to raid your opponent, you can actually go for his buildings and melt them, because right now you have a 10 attack unit that also gains a 2 extra attack bonus versus buildings. So this is a very difficult situation for your opponents to deal with. But to be very fair, I think that this is not the most recommended approach for the Goth, because there are several counters to that, and I'm just going to make a small list for you. 1. Unique units that are actually better than the horse call. So if you have any civilization with an infantry unique unit, they are most likely going to beat the horse call. Let me make a small list. Viking berserkers beat horse calls in 1v1, Celtwold raiders beat horse calls in 1v1, Liao Diao from the Kittens beat horse calls in 1v1, Japanese samurai beat the horse calls in 1v1, Elite Teutonite obviously beat the horse calls in 1v1. So all of these units in equal numbers are going to win. So unless the god sacrifice some of his economy to spend and try to win on numbers, he's actually gonna die because of the quality of those units. In the 1v1, the horse call will die to most units, and that's one of the issues, and that's one of the reasons I would not recommend. The second thing here is civilizations with access to knight. Going for the horse call is a very big investment because of the castle and also the anarchy. So if you're playing against a civilization that has good knights, for example Franks, Berbers, Huns, or whatever, this guy can just win by spamming knights and patrolling them over your horse calls. And the other counter to that is, apart from knights and unique units, is actually having to play against a guy that has one specific unit, for example the Inca Kamayuk, or playing against monks. Monks from any civilization are actually one of the greatest counters to infantry, and honestly, especially on the early stages of the game where you are not constantly spamming horse calls like in Imperial Age, monks can be one of the big nemesis here for the Goth. So in case you want to, I would recommend that you avoid going heavy horse calls there unless you have specific scenarios. Instead, just leave these horse call spam to be made during the next stage, during the Imperial Age. With that said, let's take a look on how things evolve and how can the Goth overcome these situations of fighting a civilization that has better infantry. If we just analyze here, one of the ways that the Goth has to deal with civilizations with better infantry units, for example the Vikings, is to try to outnumber the Vikings. So one of the best and honestly one of the most common ways for the Goth to try to win fights is actually by outnumbering his opponent. The Goth should never aim to fight in a 1 versus 1 scenario versus a horse call versus a wold raider. You should always be looking to overwhelm your opponent with numbers, because in the quality the Goth cannot withstand. If your opponent can match your numbers as the Goth, you are always going to die. So if that is the case, my personal recommendation is that you either try to spend and outspend the enemy on the pure wage, or that you try to transition into some different kind of unit, for example some counter to the enemy infantry. I think that one of the best counters that the Goth player can use here against the enemy infantry infantry are the hand cannoneers. On this game, for example, you can see that the God player is still messing up Hurskalls, while his opponent is going for the Berserkers. And now he's on Imperial Age, so he can start upgrading his Hurskalls and gaining extra attack. And of course, he can try to outnumber, but in similar numbers, he will never gonna win against the Berserkers. Also, some of these units can be quite crafty. For example, take a look on the Berserkers. They do regenerate over time, so engaging and disengaging can actually be one of the greatest strategies here for the Viking player to try and take down the Hurskalls before they get fully upgraded. With that said, the Goth needs to do something about that, so either win by numbers or make a transition, because in the 1v1, to be very honest, most of the civilizations are actually going to win versus the Goth on the infantry combats. One of my personal favorite ways to play the Goth against infantry civilizations is to actually go for champions. The Hurskalls are quite expensive. You are actually going for 25 gold and actually going for 53 food here, only to have extra armor, extra pierce armor. Instead, I would actually go towards the champion line, because this one is actually very cheap. You are only going to play like 35 food and 14 gold once you are on the Imperial Age, making them very easy to spend. So my personal recommendation, instead of going for full Hurskal like we're seeing in this game, go for the full champion line, because this is actually, or probably most likely, the best unit that you can do to overcome in an infantry war. Still, if you are feeling way too overwhelmed by the infantry and you feel like your opponent can get an edge versus your infantry, that is like unlikely that you are going to win even with the champions, and this will most likely happen when your opponent has an elite infantry unit of other kind, like the Berserker, like the Jaguar, as I just said. Then the way to go is to go for the chemistry and transition into some ranged unit. If you are facing infantry, my personal recommendation will always go for the hand cannoneer, because it does have a good bonus against infantry. So hand cannoneers from the Goth, and then you just stop thinking as an infantry civilization and start to think about as a gunpowder civilization. The Goth does have access to hand cannoneer, it does have access to bombard cannon, so basically you have two of the best weapons to play here as a gunpowder civilization, and then it's just about adding a mid shield on the front. Honestly, I would say that you can still keep spamming your own infantry on the front to fulfill most of these purposes. Right there, the Goth is still in a very comfortable position on this game, mostly because he has numbers. He never had less army than his opponent, so basically playing on numbers is how the Goth win the games. That's always that's how you should play. But in case your numbers start falling and the opponent starts making a unit that has way too much quality, for example the Elite Berserker that we are seeing here, regenerating and also playing with 4 pierce armor so far and 18 HP, then hand cannoneers is the way to go, because with hand cannoneers the infantry civs can get lured into countering the Goth infantry and they just will not have their counters prepared. The best counters to hand cannoneer are the ranged units, and if your opponent tries to go for ranged units, well, then you have both Hurskal or even the champions here to make a front line for your hand cannoneers to harass the enemy. So that's basically how you want to play, that's basically what you want to do. A massive amount of hand cannoneers, monks, and basically you have the counters for whatever the infantry cannot kill. So of course this will be very important in some matchups, but not so relevant into others, because there are some matchups that are actually not so great to play against the Goth, and we're actually going to talk about those.